$80 million. That's what my husband left behind. But at the will reading, my daughter-in-law looked right at me and said I wasn't getting a single cent. Just like that. No hesitation, no explanation, like I'd already been erased. I sat there, listening to lawyers and strangers talk about his life, about the house, the accounts, the foundation, everything we built together, now spoken of like it never had my name on it. I kept quiet because I didn't want to make a scene. But when the lawyer stopped, looked up from the papers and smiled, something inside me shifted. That smile told me this story wasn't over. And if you've ever been pushed aside and told you don't matter, you'll understand what came next. My name is Helen Carter, and I'm 63 years old. I have lived in Charleston all my life. I grew up here, married here, raised my son here, and I thought I would grow old quietly in the same house my husband and I built together. But life does not always turn out the way we imagine. On the morning of my husband's funeral, I woke up before the sun came up. The house was quiet in that heavy way that makes you feel watched. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his side of it. His glasses were still on the nightstand. His robe hung on the back of the chair. For a long time, I just sat there, not knowing what to do first. When I finally got dressed, I chose a dark navy dress that Thomas always liked. It felt wrong to care about what to wear, but it was the only thing I could control. I pinned my hair back, took one last look at the empty chair by the window, and left. The church was only 15 minutes away, but the drive felt endless. Every red light stayed red too long. I kept thinking that maybe if I drove slowly enough, I could make the day take longer to start. The church was St. Andrew's, a small white building with high windows and magnolia trees lining the sidewalk. The smell of the flowers was already fading in the heat. Inside, everything looked perfect. The pews were polished, the music soft, the air heavy with perfume and candle wax. My daughter-in-law, Lydia Pierce, was standing at the front near the casket, talking to the ushers and arranging papers in her folder. She had organized everything herself. It was the kind of service you might see in a magazine. Perfect timing, perfect lighting, perfect distance from anything that felt human. I sat in the last row because I didn't want to be in anyone's way. People came up to me before the service started, touching my arm, saying how sorry they were. I nodded, said thank you, and watched them move on to the next person. Everyone said the same things. He was a great man. You were lucky to have him. He's in a better place now. I wanted to ask them how they could be so sure of that. I wanted to ask if they had seen how tired he looked near the end, how much he tried to stay strong for everyone else. But I didn't ask anything. I just sat there and let their words pass by like the wind. When the organ began to play, the sound filled the whole church. It was supposed to comfort us, but it only made me feel smaller. Lydia walked down the aisle with a calm, graceful step, her head high, her dress spotless. People looked at her with admiration. I heard someone behind me whisper, "She really held it all together." Another voice said, "Well, she's always been strong." They were talking about her, not me. I was invisible in my own husband's funeral. The priest spoke about Thomas's generosity, his success, his work with the Carter Foundation. He mentioned our 40 years of marriage, but not my name. Maybe it was written somewhere in his notes, and he forgot. I watched him talk and tried to listen, but all I could think about was how still Thomas's hands must be inside that casket. For 40 years, those hands built our home, cooked breakfast every Sunday, fixed every broken chair, and held mine whenever the world felt too heavy. Now they were folded quietly under a piece of white cloth. When the service ended, people started lining up to leave. Some came over to hug me. Others avoided my eyes, like they were afraid of catching my sadness. Lydia stood near the exit, thanking everyone, smiling politely. My son, Michael, stood next to her, saying very little. He had always been quiet, more like his father than me. When I walked past him, he kissed my cheek and said, "You did great, Mom." I didn't even know what that meant. I wanted to ask if he was okay, but he was already turning to greet someone else. Outside, the sun was bright. The air smelled of grass and car exhaust. People were talking about lunch plans, flights, hotels. It was as if they couldn't wait to go back to their lives. I looked around, waiting for someone to ask if I needed a ride home. No one did. Lydia was already speaking to the funeral director, signing something on a clipboard. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to do next, then started walking toward the back garden of the church. Behind the building there was a small patch of magnolia trees. Thomas used to like walking there after Sunday service. The ground was covered with petals, some fresh, some brown around the edges. The gardener had trimmed most of the branches, but one low branch still held a few dying blossoms. I stopped and looked at them. The smell was faint, but it brought back a whole flood of memories. Thomas mowing the lawn in the summer, me calling him in for lemonade, both of us sitting on the porch as the evening came down. A young man from the church staff was sweeping the walkway. He looked up, nodded, and said, "Ma'am, I'll be done soon." I told him it was fine, that I was just looking. My voice didn't sound like mine. I bent down, picked up one of the petals, and held it in my palm. It felt soft and cold at the same time. I slipped it into my coat pocket without knowing why. Maybe I just wanted to keep something from that day that wasn't paperwork or pity. When the hearse started moving, I stood by the gate and watched it drive away until it disappeared around the corner. I expected to cry then, but nothing came. I wasn't numb, just empty. It felt like the world had folded in on itself. I could hear the wind moving through the magnolia trees. It sounded like breathing. I told myself to go home, to eat something, but my feet didn't move. After a while, the parking lot cleared. The priest walked past and said, "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Carter." I nodded, though I didn't know what that meant anymore. When I finally walked back toward the church door, I noticed that one of the wreaths near the entrance had fallen slightly to the side. A few petals were scattered on the stone steps. I bent down and brushed them aside. The custodian came by and asked if I needed help. I said no, thanked him, and walked to my car. Before I got in, I looked back at the church one last time. Through the glass doors, I could still see Lydia talking to someone, smiling that calm, confident smile. For a moment, I wondered if she even noticed that I was still there. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she thought the story was over now that Thomas was gone. But as I stood there, the wind caught one of the magnolia petals on the ground and lifted it just a little before it fell again. I don't know why, but that small movement made something inside me tighten. I realized that silence was all I had left. And maybe that could be enough. People thought they buried one man that day, but they buried parts of me too. And I don't think anyone in that church understood how heavy that felt. But I did. I felt every ounce of it as I drove home alone, with that magnolia petal still in my pocket. A week after the funeral, I got an email from Lydia's assistant. It wasn't even from her directly. The subject line said, "Estate Administration Meeting, Attendance Required." There was no greeting, no condolences, just the time, date, and address of the law office. I read it twice, trying to feel something, but all I felt was tired. I didn't reply. I just marked the date on my calendar and left the message sitting there like a bruise I didn't want to touch. The morning of the meeting, Charleston was gray and cold. I left the house earlier than I needed to. The drive downtown took longer than usual because of traffic, and I had to circle the block twice before I found a parking spot. The building was tall, all glass and steel, the kind of place where silence feels expensive. The sign on the front read, "Pearson Lowell Associates." Lydia's name was printed on the directory in bold letters under Senior Partner. When I walked into the lobby, a young woman at the front desk looked up from her computer. She gave me the kind of smile people give when they're not sure who you are. I told her my name, and she asked me to wait. A few minutes later, another assistant came and led me to the conference room. My shoes made small sounds on the marble floor. Everything smelled like paper and disinfectant. The room was large, with a long table that could seat 10 people. The windows looked out over the street, but the blinds were half closed, so the light came in thin and cold. There were folders and cups of coffee already set on the table. Lydia was sitting at the head of it, her hair pulled back tight, a tablet in front of her. She didn't stand up when I came in. She didn't even say hello. She just nodded toward a chair at the far end of the table. There were 6 other people in the room, 2 men from the firm, a notary, and a few others I didn't recognize. No one spoke as I sat down. The sound of the chair against the floor felt louder than it should have. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Lydia cleared her throat. Her voice was calm and professional. "As executor of the estate," she began, "I'll be going over the distribution of assets as outlined in the finalized will." She spoke like she was leading a meeting at work, not talking about the man I'd spent 40 years with. She went through everything, the stocks, the commercial properties, the education fund, the foundation accounts. She read the numbers in a steady voice, page after page. I sat there listening, but it felt like she was speaking another language. My name didn't come up once. After a while, one of the younger associates hesitated and looked toward her. "And Mrs. Carter's allocation?" he asked quietly. His voice was polite, uncertain. Lydia didn't look up. She just said, There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing. Then she turned the page and kept talking. That was it. No explanation, no mention of the years I'd managed the household, the business, the hospital visits, the nights sleeping in a chair beside Thomas's bed. It was like I had been erased. No one in the room said anything else. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. I looked around the table, but no one would meet my eyes. They were all busy writing notes, checking their folders, pretending this was normal. I thought about speaking up, about asking how it happened, when it happened, why I hadn't been told. But I didn't. I couldn't. My throat felt tight and I was afraid my voice would crack. So I sat still and let the moment pass. When the meeting ended, everyone began to pack up their things. Lydia closed her tablet, gathered her papers, and stood. "We'll proceed with the next steps this week," she said, still not looking at me. Her tone was polite, final. I realized she planned it this way, so that I would have no space to ask, no room to fight. I waited until everyone else had left the room before I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor again, sharp in the empty space. I looked at the stack of folders still sitting on the table, at the untouched cup of coffee next to mine. The smell had gone cold. As I walked toward the elevator, I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass wall. Small, gray, someone who didn't belong there. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside. My reflection doubled in the metal panel, two versions of me staring back. When I reached the ground floor, I walked outside. The cold air hit my face. I stood there for a minute before heading to my car. The world outside kept moving, people with briefcases, phones, coffee cups, all rushing somewhere. I stood still among them, invisible. By the time I got home, it was almost noon. The house felt emptier than it had the week before. I hung up my coat and sat at the kitchen table. The papers from the hospital were still there, the ones Lydia had promised to handle. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, steady, and calm. I thought about everything that had just happened. 40 years of my life had been reduced to a few lines in a legal document that no longer had my name in it. I wasn't angry yet. I was something else. Hollow, maybe. Like I'd been erased from the record, but the memories were still inside me, alive and restless, refusing to disappear. That was the day I understood that silence could make you disappear just as easily as it could protect you. And sitting there in that cold kitchen, I promised myself one thing. I would find out what really happened. That afternoon, only a few hours after the meeting at the law office, Lydia came by the house. She didn't call first. I saw her car pull up through the kitchen window. She walked up the path with that same calm pace, heels clicking on the stone. She was holding a small velvet box in her hand. When I opened the door, she smiled politely, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "I just wanted to drop this off," she said. "It's something Thomas left for you." Her voice was smooth, businesslike, not a trace of emotion. I stepped aside and let her in. The house still smelled faintly of the flowers from the funeral. She didn't take off her coat or sit down. She placed the box on the dining table, said, "He asked me to give you this," and stood there like she was waiting for me to open it. I looked at the box for a few seconds before lifting the lid. Inside was a silver pocket watch. It was old but polished, the initials 2HC engraved neatly on the back. The hands were frozen at 11:11. I recognized it instantly. It was one of Thomas's favorites, a gift from an old friend years ago. I ran my thumb over the engraving and said quietly, "He always loved this one." Lydia nodded, still standing there with her hands folded in front of her. "Yes," she said, "he wanted you to have it." Her tone didn't match her words. It was too quick, too clean, as if she was checking something off a list. I waited for her to say more, maybe something kind or personal, but she didn't. After a moment, she looked at her watch and said, "I have another meeting, but I'll be in touch once the next phase of the process begins." Then she turned and walked toward the door. I followed her out of habit, stopping at the hallway. She turned once, smiled that same practiced smile, and said, "Take care, Helen." Then the door closed. I stood there for a while, the watch still in my hand. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin. The air felt heavy, almost stale. I sat down at the table, staring at the watch. The hands hadn't moved in years, but somehow it still felt alive, like it was holding something back. 11:11. That was the exact time he'd passed. I remembered it clearly because the nurse had said it out loud when she checked his pulse. I wondered if that was a coincidence or if Thomas had meant something by it. He was the kind of man who believed in details. He used to leave little notes for me around the house, reminders to eat lunch or buy milk. He said small things carried meaning because people overlooked them. I thought about that now, looking at the still watch face. I turned it over a few times in my hand. The back panel was smooth, but when I pressed lightly, it clicked. I realized there was a small hinge. Inside was a faded photograph, me and Thomas, from years ago, standing in front of the old lake house. I'd forgotten that picture even existed. I felt my throat tighten. The photo was worn and yellowed, but it made the room around me blur. I closed the watch carefully and placed it on the table. I didn't cry. I just sat there, staring at the silver circle reflecting the ceiling light. My reflection looked strange, older, tired. For a second, I thought I saw movement, like the faintest twitch of the clock's hand, but it didn't move again. When the sun began to set, I made some tea and carried the cup into the living room. The house still had a smell, faint but familiar. Aftershave, paper, something warm and comforting. I placed the watch on the armrest beside me. The room grew darker until only the outline of the furniture was visible. Later that night, I went upstairs and put the watch on the nightstand beside my bed. I left the lamp on low. The metal caught the light, glowing faintly. I lay back and listened to the quiet. For the first time since Thomas died, I let myself feel the full weight of it. I wasn't angry yet, not even sad in the usual way. Just lost. I turned toward the watch again. The hands were still at 11:11. It looked peaceful, but it also felt like a message, one I didn't understand yet. Maybe he wanted to tell me something. Maybe he had, and I just wasn't ready to hear it. I reached out and touched the cold surface once before turning off the light. The room went completely still. Somewhere outside, a clock struck the hour, and I realized how strange it felt to hear time moving again when his watch would never start. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the outline of the watch in the dark. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting for something. A few days after Lydia brought the watch, the house started to feel heavier. It wasn't the kind of weight you could clean away. It was in the air, in the walls, in the way every sound echoed a little too long. I decided to start organizing Thomas's office. I told myself it was just to keep busy, but the truth was I couldn't stand the thought of that room staying closed forever. When I opened the door, the smell hit me right away. Paper, oak, and that faint scent of tobacco that always clung to him. The curtains were still half open, letting in gray light from outside. The desk was the same as he had left it. A few books stacked neatly on one corner, his glasses resting on a file, a pen still uncapped. For a second, I almost said his name out loud, like he might answer from the hallway. I sat down in his chair and ran my hands across the surface of the desk. The wood was scratched and worn, but clean. Thomas always took care of his things. I opened the top drawer first. It was full of receipts, old letters, some folded newspaper clippings. The second drawer had notebooks, a few of them still sealed. The bottom drawer held photo albums and old family papers. I didn't find anything unusual, but I kept going. On the shelf behind the desk was our wedding photo. It had been there for years. The frame was old, silver-plated, slightly tilted. In the picture, we were both smiling. I remember that day so clearly. My dress wrinkled at the bottom, Thomas laughing because the wind kept blowing his tie. I lifted the frame to wipe the glass. When I did, the back felt loose. The small metal tab had come undone, and as I turned it, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fell to the floor. I froze. The sound of it hitting the carpet was soft, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. I picked it up carefully. The paper was yellowed, folded twice, the edges worn smooth. My hands started to shake before I even opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, Thomas's. It was unsteady, the letters uneven. It said, "Lydia wants to update the will. She says it's just to make things clear. I haven't signed yet. Don't tell Helen. She'll ask the questions I'm afraid of." I read it again and again until the words blurred. My throat went dry. My first thought was that it couldn't be real, that maybe it was an old draft, something from years ago. But the paper was dated just 3 months before he died. I sat down on the edge of the chair and stared at the letter. The air in the room felt thin. My hands were cold, even though the heater was on. A memory came to me suddenly, like a flash I couldn't stop. It was one of the last evenings we spent together at home. Thomas was sitting in the same chair, the one I was sitting in now, sorting through papers. I'd asked him what he was doing, and he'd said, "Just updating some things for Lydia, nothing important." I remember laughing, teasing him that Lydia was too serious for her own good. He smiled and said, "Don't worry about her. She's more sensible than you think." At the time, I believed him. He had said it with such calm. Now those words sounded like something else, like a warning I hadn't heard. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the rain had started, soft but steady. The drops hit the glass in slow, even beats. I pressed my fingers against the pane. The cold seeped into my skin. I turned back to the desk and looked at the letter again, lying there, open on the surface. The room felt different now. The chair, the books, the smell of his cologne. All of it was still him, but the warmth was gone. I looked at his photograph again. The smile I'd always loved now looked strange, almost distant. I wondered what he'd been thinking when he wrote that note. Was he protecting me? Or was he protecting her? I picked up the letter and folded it again, carefully along the same creases. I put it back inside the frame and set it on the shelf. Then I sat down and just listened. The rain got heavier, hitting the window harder. It sounded like a clock, steady and endless. I thought about everything that had happened in the last 2 weeks, how fast it all moved. The funeral, the will, the silence in every room. It was like someone had rewritten our entire life and left me with the scraps. But this piece of paper, this note, it was his hand, his voice. It was proof that something wasn't right. For the first time since he died, I felt something other than grief. It wasn't anger, not yet, but it was close. It was the small spark of a question I couldn't ignore anymore. I stood up, turned off the lamp, and walked toward the door. Before I left the room, I looked back one more time. The letter was back behind the photo, hidden again, just like he had left it. But now I knew it was there. As I closed the door, I whispered quietly, "I used to be afraid you'd leave me, Thomas. Now I'm afraid of your silence." Downstairs, the clock in the hallway ticked once, then stopped for a moment, as if it had heard me. I waited, holding my breath until it started again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the sound of the rain against the window, thinking about the letter, about Lydia, about all the things I hadn't seen. Time had stopped for Thomas at 11:11, but for me, that was when the truth began to move. The next morning, the rain hadn't stopped. It wasn't a storm, just that steady kind of drizzle that makes the world look softer but heavier at the same time. I hadn't slept much. I kept thinking about the letter, about Thomas's handwriting, about the way he had written my name like he wasn't sure he had the right anymore. By sunrise, I knew I couldn't just sit in that house another day. There was one person I could talk to, someone who had known Thomas almost as long as I had, Edward Hale. He was one of Thomas's oldest friends, a retired lawyer who had helped him set up the Carter Foundation years ago. They'd grown apart over time, mostly after Thomas's health started failing, and Lydia took over the business side of things. But Edward had always been the kind of man who saw through people. Calm, patient, the kind of person who never raised his voice but somehow made you listen. I called him that morning. He sounded surprised to hear from me but said, "Of course, Helen, let's meet. How about the Magnolia and Finch Cafe around noon?" His voice was still the same, steady, kind. The cafe was small, tucked away on a quiet corner near the river. It had been there for decades. Thomas and I used to go there when we were younger, before everything became meetings and appointments. The bell above the door still made the same sound when I walked in. The air smelled like coffee and rain. Edward was already there, sitting by the window. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, his hair completely white now, but his eyes were the same. When he saw me, he stood up right away and smiled. "Helen," he said, "it's been too long." I smiled back. "It feels like another lifetime," I said. He gestured for me to sit. The waiter brought us coffee without even asking. We sat for a while without speaking, just watching the rain slide down the window. Then he said softly, "I'm sorry about Thomas. He was a good man." I nodded, my hands around the warm cup. "He was," I said quietly, "but I think something happened before he died. Something I didn't see." Edward's expression changed slightly, just enough to show that he was listening differently now. "Go on," he said. I reached into my purse and took out the folded letter. The edges were already worn from how many times I'd opened it. I slid it across the table. He read it slowly, lips moving a little, his brow tightening as he reached the last line. When he finished, he set it down carefully like he didn't want to damage it. After a long pause, he said, "He knew something was wrong. This wasn't written in confusion. It's too clear for that." I felt my chest tighten. "You think he suspected Lydia?" Edward looked down at the paper again. "I think he trusted her too much. Thomas always had a blind spot for people he thought were helping him." He leaned back, sighing quietly. He must have felt pressured. The way he mentioned not telling you, that sounds like someone who was afraid of being pushed into something he didn't understand. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, listening to the rain and the sound of coffee cups clinking in the background. He glanced at me again. "Have you talked to anyone else about this?" I shook my head. "No one. I don't even know what to do with it yet." Edward looked out the window, thoughtful. "I can check a few things," he said finally. "I still know people at the probate office. Maybe we can find out if there were drafts, revisions, anything filed before the final version." I hesitated. Would that cause trouble? He smiled slightly. "Truth usually does." We sat quietly for a moment. The rain outside got heavier, running down the glass in crooked lines. It felt strange, sitting there with someone from another part of my life, talking about Thomas like he was both present and gone. Edward took a sip of his coffee, then asked, "Can I ask you something, Helen? What is it you want from all this? Do you want justice or peace?" I looked at him for a long time before answering. "Maybe they're the same thing," I said. "If justice isn't about revenge, maybe it's about putting things back where they belong." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant he understood more than he said. "You sound like Thomas," he murmured. "He used to say that fairness was just love in a different language." I smiled at that, though it hurt. He believed that, even when people didn't deserve it. Edward folded the letter again and handed it back to me. "Keep this safe," he said. "It's not just paper. It's your proof that he had doubts, and that means something." I slipped the letter back into my purse. "I don't even know what to look for," I admitted. He smiled, faint but kind. "That's what I'm here for. Let me do some checking. Quietly. If there's something buried, we'll find it." Outside, the rain began to slow, the light shifting from gray to pale silver. The cafe had started to fill with the late lunch crowd, the hum of quiet voices mixing with the soft music overhead. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Maybe it was just because someone finally believed me, or maybe it was because I wasn't alone in this anymore. When we stood up to leave, Edward reached out and squeezed my hand. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "Thomas always knew that." I nodded. "I just wish he'd told me what he was afraid of." He looked at me with a kind of tired kindness. "Maybe he did, Helen. Just not in words you were ready to hear." We walked out together, standing for a moment under the awning as the last drops of rain fell. He gave me a reassuring smile before heading to his car. As I watched him drive away, I felt the letter in my purse like a heartbeat. Whatever had been hidden, whatever had been taken, it was still out there. And if they had rewritten Thomas's story, then I would write the ending myself. It had been 3 days since I met Edward at the cafe when he called me again. His voice sounded different this time, slower, heavier. "Helen," he said, "I think you should come by my office. I found something you'll want to see." I drove there that afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled damp, and the streets were lined with puddles that reflected the gray sky. Edward's office was small, tucked behind a row of old buildings downtown. He had kept it even after retiring. "Just in case," he'd once said. When I walked in, he was sitting behind a desk stacked with files. He looked up, smiled softly, and motioned for me to sit down. "I went through the county records," he said, "and compared them with what Lydia's firm filed after Thomas passed." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Helen, something isn't right." He opened a folder and slid a few papers toward me. The top page had the words, "Last Will and Testament," revised, printed in bold. Beneath it was a list of witness signatures. I didn't recognize either of the names. "Do you know these people?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. Thomas never used strangers for anything official. He always asked people he trusted." Edward nodded. "That's what I thought. I checked both names. Neither of them ever worked with Thomas. One was a temp at Lydia's firm. The other doesn't seem to exist in any business registry at all." I stared at the page, my hands suddenly cold. "So they faked witnesses?" He hesitated. "I can't say that yet. but they weren't people your husband would have chosen. He flipped to the next document, a copy of the will itself. And here's something else. There's no authentication stamp. Normally, every executed will is notarized and recorded. This one isn't. It looks official, but it's missing the validation mark. I looked closer, and there it was. An empty corner where a seal should have been. Just white space. Edward leaned back in his chair. That's not all. I checked the older version, the one from 2 years ago. The one you and Thomas signed together. It's been marked superseded. That's normal when a new will replaces it. But there's no record of who submitted the change, or when. The space for authorized executor is blank. I let out a shaky breath. How can that happen? It shouldn't, he said simply. It means the transfer was processed without a proper sign-off. Someone inside the system approved it quietly. I sat back, trying to take it in. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. When was the new one filed? Edward turned a few pages and pointed. 6 months before Thomas died. I blinked. 6 months? But he was still in the hospital then? Yes, Edward said softly. That's what worries me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the old ceiling fan. My mind ran through all those months, the appointments, the nights in the hospital, Lydia coming and going with papers for him to sign. I remembered how he'd waved me off, saying, "It's just legal work, Helen. Don't worry yourself." I rubbed my hands together, trying to keep them from shaking. He trusted her, I said quietly. He thought she was helping. Edward looked at me, his expression steady but kind. And she used that trust. I felt something shift inside me, not quite anger, but something close, a kind of cold clarity. Can this be fixed? I asked. He nodded slowly. Maybe, but we'll have to be careful. If we go in too strong, they'll shut the files down before we get what we need. Let me talk to someone I know at the clerk's office, quietly. We'll confirm whether those signatures were real and if the missing authorization can be traced. I nodded, not because I was calm, but because I needed to stay that way. Whatever it takes, I said. Edward gave a faint smile. That's the Helen I remember. He gathered the papers back into the folder and handed me a copy. Keep this with you. Don't show it to anyone else yet, not even Michael. I hesitated. He doesn't know any of this. Not yet, Edward said. But when you tell him, make sure you have the truth in your hands. When I left the office, the sky was beginning to clear. The light was sharp, pale, the kind that makes everything look cleaner than it really is. I stood by my car for a while, holding the folder against my chest. I thought about Thomas, about the man who always said life should be simple, fair, honest. I wondered if he'd known what Lydia was doing and had just been too weak to stop her. On the drive home, I passed the hospital where he'd spent his last months. I slowed down at the intersection. The windows of his old room faced the road. I remembered sitting there beside him, holding his hand while he signed forms Lydia had brought. I hadn't asked what they were. I'd trusted her too. When I got home, I placed the folder on the kitchen table next to the pocket watch. The two things sat there side by side, one frozen in time, the other trying to rewrite it. That evening, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the last bit of daylight fade. I felt a strange calmness settle in, the kind that comes when you finally stop pretending everything is fine. I whispered to the empty room, I can't cry for the dead when the living are still burying me with laws. The watch on the table caught the last glint of light before it disappeared. For a moment, I thought I heard it tick. Edward called me 2 days later. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet energy behind it. Helen, he said, I think it's time you talk to someone else, someone who can help us move forward. I didn't ask who, I just said, all right. He gave me an address on King Street, an old brick building I remembered from years ago. Her name's Marjorie Dean, he added. She used to be one of the best in probate law before she went private. Don't let her calm tone fool you. She's sharper than most men half her age. That afternoon I drove into town. The sky was clear for once, but the light felt cold. The office was on the second floor of a narrow building that looked more like a bookstore than a law firm. Inside, it smelled faintly of coffee and paper. There were no gold signs or fancy furniture, just a few framed certificates on the wall and a tall plant by the window. A woman came out of the back room holding a folder. Her hair was silver gray, cut neatly to her shoulders. She wore a charcoal blazer, no jewelry except for a thin wedding band. Her eyes were sharp, but her expression wasn't unkind. "Mrs. Carter?" she said. "Yes," I answered. She offered her hand. "Marjorie Dean." Her handshake was firm, steady. "Edward spoke highly of you. Please, sit." I took a seat in front of her desk. Edward was already there, sitting off to the side. He gave me a small, reassuring nod. Marjorie set the folder down, opened a notebook, and said, "Edward told me a little about what's been happening. I'd like to hear it from you directly." I took a breath and told her everything. The will reading, the missing name, the unsigned authorization, the letter I found behind the photo. I tried to keep my voice even, but it wavered once when I mentioned Thomas's handwriting. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, thinking for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I've met a lot of women like Lydia. They come in different names and faces, but they all have the same idea, that the law is a wall. They think once they build it, no one can climb over. But what they forget," she paused, "is that the law also has doors. You just have to know where to knock." Something in her voice made me straighten a little. She wasn't comforting me, she was giving me a direction. Edward handed her the copies of the will and the letter. She studied them silently for a while, tracing the handwriting with her finger. When she saw the missing seal on the will, she frowned. "This isn't just sloppy," she said. "It's deliberate. The lack of authentication, the false witnesses, these are signs of fabrication." I felt my heart beat faster. "You mean it was forged?" Marjorie nodded slowly. "I mean it was changed, and not by your husband. Whether it's legally fraudulent depends on who filed it and what pressure was involved. But the signs are there." She looked at me carefully, her tone steady but serious. "If we do this, Helen, it won't be quick. People like Lydia know how to hide behind paper and procedure. You'll have to be patient, and you'll have to be sure." I nodded. "I've been patient for a long time." For the first time, she smiled slightly, not out of politeness, but approval. "Good. Then let's start with the facts." She began listing what we would need: certified copies of both wills, hospital records showing Thomas's condition when the revisions were supposedly signed, and any correspondence between Lydia's firm and the estate office. Edward was taking notes quietly beside her. I sat still, trying to keep up, but mostly just watching Marjorie work. She had a calmness that made the room feel steady again. After she finished writing, she looked up. "Bring me the original letter when you're ready. I'll have it examined. Handwriting, ink, everything. It's a small piece of truth, but sometimes that's all it takes to open a door." I took a slow breath. "Do you really think we can prove it?" Marjorie met my eyes and said, "Mrs. Carter, I don't chase revenge. I chase records. Paper doesn't lie, even when people do. If there's a lie in this will, we'll find it." Edward smiled faintly, his eyes soft. "Told you she was the best," he said. When I stood to leave, Marjorie walked me to the door. "You seem like someone who believes in fairness," she said quietly. "That's good. Just remember, fairness and law aren't always the same thing. Sometimes you have to make them meet in the middle." I nodded. "Thank you, Marjorie." She smiled just enough to show the lines at the corners of her eyes. "Justice doesn't need a robe, Mrs. Carter. It just needs a steady hand." Outside, the late afternoon sun was fading behind the buildings. I walked slowly to my car, feeling something new I hadn't felt in weeks. Not relief, not peace, but resolve. For the first time since Thomas's death, I wasn't just reacting. I was acting. It was almost 2 weeks after I first met Marjorie when she called one evening. Her voice was quiet but urgent. "Helen, we have someone who wants to talk. She's nervous, but she reached out to me on her own. Her name's Clara Jennings. She works, or used to work, for Pearson Lowell." I sat up straight. "Lydia's firm?" "Yes," Marjorie said. "She was an assistant there. She says she has information about the signing of the will. I want you to come in tomorrow morning. She asked to meet you too." The next morning, the air outside was cold and sharp. I drove to Marjorie's office with a strange mix of hope and fear twisting in my chest. When I arrived, Edward was already there, standing by the window. Marjorie sat behind her desk, and across from her was a young woman, mid-20s maybe. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and she kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone to walk in. Marjorie looked up. "Helen, this is Clara Jennings." I gave her a small nod. "Thank you for coming," I said softly. Clara tried to smile but couldn't. Her voice was small when she finally spoke. "I wasn't sure I should be here, but after everything that's happened, I can't stay quiet anymore." Marjorie leaned forward slightly. "Take your time," she said, trying to tell us what you remember. Clara took a deep breath. "It was a Sunday night. I remember because I was supposed to be off that day, but Lydia called and said she needed help with some final documents for Mr. Carter's estate. She told me to come in, said it was urgent and that she'd explain when I got there." She paused, eyes flicking down to her hands. "When I arrived, the office was almost empty, just Lydia and one of the senior clerks. She had a folder open on the conference table and asked me to sign a witness line on a document. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I asked if Mr. Carter was coming, she said, 'He's just stepped out. It's already approved. We just need to finish the paperwork.'" Edward's face went pale. "You didn't see him there?" Clara shook her head. "No, he wasn't there. I didn't see him that whole night. But Lydia insisted, said it was routine. I was young, new to the job. I didn't want to make trouble." Her voice cracked slightly. "So I signed." Marjorie nodded slowly. "Do you remember the time?" Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, worn, creased, with faint ink stains on the cover. "I keep notes of everything," she said quietly. "That night, after I got home, something didn't sit right, so I wrote it down." She opened the notebook and slid it toward Marjorie. There, written in neat handwriting, was a single line. 7:43 p.m. Witnessed signature for R. No tea present. For a moment the room went completely still. I could hear the faint hum of the heater and the soft scrape of Marjorie's pen as she underlined the words. Claire looked up at me then, her eyes wet. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe I was imagining things. But when the news came that Mr. Carter had passed, and then the will was announced, I realized what I'd done. I helped sign something that shouldn't have been signed. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, but recognition. I saw myself in her, younger, unsure, afraid of saying the wrong thing. "You were doing what you thought you had to," I said quietly. "We all stay silent for something. Fear, loyalty, the idea that it's not our place. But the silence always costs more in the end." Clara wiped her eyes quickly. "Does it ever stop costing?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Maybe not. But telling the truth once, even if it hurts, costs less than living with it forever." She nodded slowly. "Then I want to tell the truth now." Marjorie opened a fresh document and pushed it across the table. "This is a formal witness statement," she said. "You don't have to sign it today, but if you're ready, it will make everything official." Clara hesitated for just a second, then picked up the pen. Her hands were shaking, but she signed anyway. When she finished, she let out a long breath, like she'd been holding it for years. Marjorie took the paper, stamped it, and said softly, "You did the right thing?" Clara stood up, still trembling. "I just hope it matters," she said. "It does," I told her. "You've done something most people never find the courage to do." She gave a small, tearful smile before leaving the room. The door closed gently behind her, and for a while no one spoke. Edward finally broke the silence. "That's the first real crack in Lydia's wall." Marjorie nodded, eyes on the signed statement. "And the beginning of the truth." I looked toward the window where the morning light was starting to break through the clouds. "The truth doesn't need power," I said quietly. "It just needs someone willing to speak." It started quietly, the way most storms do. 3 days after Clara signed her statement, Marjorie filed the first official petition to review Thomas's estate records. It wasn't a lawsuit yet, just a request for transparency, but in Lydia's world, transparency was a threat. That Thursday morning, a letter arrived at my house. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with the embossed logo of Pearson Lowell Associates. My name was printed neatly across the front, Mrs. Helen Carter. No return address. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the kitchen table next to the watch, made myself coffee, and stood for a moment by the window. The air outside felt too still, as if the whole city was holding its breath. Finally, I sat down and broke the seal. The letter was written by Lydia, though her assistant had typed it. Her words were sharp and polished, every sentence shaped to sound like concern. "Helen, I've been informed that you're allowing certain individuals to reopen private family documents. I worry that people may be taking advantage of your grief. Please understand, these matters are complex. If this continues, I'll be forced to involve the firm's legal team formally. I want to protect what Thomas built, even if that means protecting it from those who can't see the full picture. With care, Lydia." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it beside the coffee cup. There was no anger in me, not anymore. Just a strange calm. I could almost hear her voice in every line, measured, polite, pretending concern while tightening control. She was nervous. That much was clear. Someone had told her that the files were being reviewed. Maybe someone inside the clerk's office, or maybe one of her associates. It didn't matter how she knew. What mattered was that she felt it. The shift. The ground beginning to move beneath her perfect shoes. For a few minutes, I sat there, staring at the folded paper. Then I reached for the pocket watch. The silver still shone in the morning light. The hands were frozen, as always, at 11:11. I turned it over in my palm. That watch had become something more than an object. It was the last piece of him that still spoke. The one thing Lydia hadn't rewritten. I pressed the small crown gently and twisted. The mechanism clicked faintly. Then, for the first time since I'd received it, the hands moved. One soft, steady motion. A quiet tick, then another. It was barely audible, but it filled the room. I sat very still, listening to that small sound. For weeks I had been surrounded by silence, the silence of grief, of lawyers, of people afraid to speak. But this was different. This was movement, a beginning. I didn't need to reply to Lydia's letter. She would know my answer soon enough, not in words, but in actions, in petitions, in records, in truth drawn out line by line. Marjorie once said that women like Lydia believe law is a wall. I used to think that too. But now, sitting in that quiet kitchen, I realized something. I had lived behind walls all my life. Politeness, patience, silence, and I had mistaken them for peace. Now, I wasn't knocking anymore. I was stepping through the door. I placed the watch back on the table and looked at it one more time. The hands had stopped again, not broken, just resting. It was enough. I smiled faintly, not because anything was fixed, but because I finally understood what needed to come next. The storm hadn't started yet, but I could feel the air changing. The wind outside rattled the window slightly, the first sign of what was coming. I reached for the letter again, folded it into a smaller square, and tucked it inside the back of my journal. Not to remember her words, but to remind myself that I had survived them. The pocket watch lay beside it, silver against the pale wood of the table. The hands still marked 11:11, the exact moment Thomas left, and the exact moment I began to find my voice. If Lydia thought I would stay quiet, she had forgotten something. I was the one who taught her how to keep time. The night of the Carter Legacy Trust Gala arrived colder than anyone expected for spring. The hotel by the Cooper River gleamed like glass under the streetlights. From the outside, you could see the chandeliers spilling gold across the ballroom windows and the reflection of moving lights dancing on the water. Cars lined up in a quiet stream at the entrance, valets opening doors, women stepping out in silk and silver. Inside, everything shone. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandeliers, the band played soft jazz, and the air carried the faint scent of lilies and expensive perfume. It was the kind of night Thomas would have hated. Too polished, too practiced. He always said real generosity didn't need to be staged. I stood near the back of the room, close to the wide windows that overlooked the river. My dress was dark purple, the same one I'd worn to our 40th anniversary. The color had faded over the years, but I didn't mind. I wasn't there to be seen. Lydia, on the other hand, was impossible to miss. She stood at the center of it all, radiant and deliberate, a glass of champagne in her hand. Every movement she made was calculated, every word rehearsed. She wore a silver gown that caught the light every time she turned her head. The photographers circled her like moths around a flame. When the music faded, one of the board members stepped up to the microphone and introduced her. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "please welcome our managing director, the woman who carries forward the Carter legacy, Mrs. Lydia Pierce." The applause was loud, polite, and practiced. Lydia smiled, tilting her chin just slightly, the perfect picture of grace. "Thank you," she began, her voice smooth, confident. "Tonight we honor not just the success of this foundation, but the heart behind it, the compassion Thomas Carter believed in. With the love and support of his family, especially my dear mother-in-law, Helen." She paused briefly, letting the name hang in the air. "We continue his vision for a better future." The crowd clapped again, cameras flashing. I stayed still. Her words didn't sting anymore. They simply passed through me like wind through a hollow door. As she continued speaking about donations, community, and legacy, my mind drifted back to those long nights in Thomas's study, the two of us sitting side by side at the desk, papers spread out between us. He'd read the clauses out loud, explaining every line, every intention. "We're not doing this for our name," he once told me. "We're doing it so someone out there sees that kindness can outlast a lifetime." That memory steadied me now. When Lydia finished her speech, the applause rose again. Glasses clinked. The photographer snapped more pictures. She smiled, nodded, and stepped down from the stage to mingle with the donors. The music resumed, a slow instrumental version of an old Sinatra tune. That was my cue. Edward was standing near one of the tables with several board members, men who had known Thomas for decades. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie a bit loose, but his presence was calm as always. When he saw me, he nodded once. I reached into my small purse and pulled out an envelope. It wasn't thick, but it carried everything. The photocopy of Thomas's handwritten note, Clara's signed statement, the notary irregularities, and Marjorie's legal brief marked with the words preliminary fraud evidence. Without a word, I handed it to Edward. He understood. Slowly, almost ceremonially, he opened it, checked the contents, and then passed it to the man beside him, one of the senior trustees. The envelope moved from hand to hand, quietly, almost invisibly, until it reached the last person at the table. The chatter around us softened as the men began reading the papers one by one. I watched their faces change. Curiosity first, then confusion, and finally silence. Someone set down their drink a little too carefully, the glass making a soft click against the table. The sound echoed through the brief pause in the music. Lydia noticed. She looked up from her conversation across the room, her smile faltering for the first time that evening. Her eyes followed the envelope as it reached the chairman's hand. He unfolded the last sheet, the one with the forged signature and Clara's timestamp note, 7:43 p.m., no tea present. Her expression froze. Just for a second, her mask slipped. The confident posture straightened too sharply, her hand tightening around her glass. She turned toward me across the room. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. There was no anger in mine, only truth. She looked away first. No one said anything. The band kept playing softly, the hum of voices returning in uneven waves. But something had shifted. You could feel it in the way people avoided her gaze, in the way whispers started to ripple between tables. The chairman closed the folder slowly and set it down beside his plate. His hand brushed the rim of his glass, and the faint clink that followed sounded heavier than a gavel. No confrontation came that night. There didn't need to be one. The papers would speak for themselves in the morning. The board would call a meeting. Lawyers would call other lawyers. The story would unfold on its own. I didn't stay for dessert. I walked out quietly, slipping past the waiters carrying trays of champagne. Outside, the air was cold and sharp again. The river shimmered under the city lights, calm and dark. I took out the pocket watch from my purse. The hands were still stopped at 11:11. I turned the crown once, gently, and listened. Tick. It was enough. I smiled faintly and whispered to myself. I didn't need to raise my voice. The paper spoke for me. Then I slipped the watch back into my coat and walked away from the hotel, the sound of distant music fading behind me, replaced by the quiet rhythm of the river, steady, alive, and honest. 3 days after the gala, the board met behind closed doors. By noon, the decision was made. The Carter Legacy Trust accounts were frozen pending review, and Lydia was suspended from her role, effective immediately. The statement was short, only a few lines, written in the same neutral tone all official letters use. But between those lines, I could hear the sound of a foundation cracking. Quiet, precise, final. By evening, the news had spread. The story was everywhere. Short articles, financial blogs, whispers on social media. Managing director steps down amid audit of Carter Legacy Trust. The words were clean, polite, but everyone knew what they meant. Lydia issued a statement through the firm 2 days later. Due to ongoing health concerns, I have decided to step back from my professional duties to focus on recovery. I remain proud of the work we accomplished and will continue to support the foundation privately. No apology, no mention of Thomas, no mention of me. Edward called that morning. I could hear papers shuffling in the background when he spoke. It's over, Helen, he said softly. The board's conducting a full audit. They've confirmed the signatures don't match, It'll take time, but the truth is standing on its own now. I took a long breath. It doesn't feel like victory, I said quietly. He chuckled, not unkindly. That's because you weren't fighting for one. He was right. Reporters began calling. Some waited outside my house for hours, hoping for a statement. I didn't give them one. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't proud either. I just wanted stillness, something honest after all the noise. When one of them finally caught me outside the gate and asked, "Mrs. Carter, do you have anything to say about the investigation?" I said only this. I didn't fight anyone. I just stood up. Then I walked back inside and closed the door. That afternoon, I went to the trust building for the first time since the gala. The hallways were quieter than I remembered. No music, no chatter, no cameras. Just the sound of shoes on tile and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. As I walked down the corridor, sunlight poured through the glass windows. It caught the dust in the air, turning everything gold for a moment. The same light that once felt harsh now felt warm. I passed the boardroom where Thomas used to sit during meetings. The plaque outside the door still bore his name, Thomas Carter, founder. I stopped for a moment and placed my hand against it. The metal was cool, but the chill didn't reach me this time. Edward was waiting near the end of the hallway. He gave me a small nod as I approached. "How does it feel?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "Lighter," I said. "Not because it's done, but because I don't have to carry it alone anymore." He nodded, understanding. That's what truth does. It doesn't always fix what's broken, but it makes it honest. We stood there for a while, saying nothing, just letting the quiet fill the space. When I stepped outside, the wind from the river carried the faint sound of boats and distant laughter. For the first time in a long while, I didn't shiver. The sun hit my face and I let it. I looked up at the sky and thought of Thomas, of his patience, his belief in kindness, his steady hand. He had wanted to leave behind something that proved goodness could last. Maybe it still could in its own quiet way. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands, steady, unshaken, and enough. A week after the board suspended Lydia, the house felt still again. No reporters outside, no calls, no noise, just the steady rhythm of quiet days. I spent the mornings in the kitchen, watering the plants Thomas had kept by the window. It had been months since I'd touched the drawers in his study. I thought I'd gone through everything already. The papers, the photos, the watch. But that morning something told me to look one more time. I opened the bottom drawer of his old desk. It stuck halfway, just as it always had. Inside were a few loose receipts, some letters, and an old envelope that had slipped behind the ledge. It was yellowed, sealed, and had a short line written on the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting. "For when you doubt me." I just stared at it for a while. The ink had faded slightly, but his writing was still steady, careful, the same way he wrote grocery lists and birthday cards. My hands trembled as I picked it up. For a moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to open it. After everything, I wasn't sure I could. When I finally did, the seal cracked softly, like a whisper from another time. Inside was a folded sheet of paper in another envelope. The paper carried his handwriting, shaky but clear. "Helen, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't explain things the way I wanted to. I know you've always trusted me, even when I didn't deserve it. I also know how easily trust can be used against us. If someone tries to rewrite what we built, please remember, the truth isn't lost. It's still in your hands. You've always been the steady one, even when I wasn't. What we built together was never about money. It was about proof that decency can survive ambition. If that belief ever fades, then everything I tried to protect would fade with it. Don't fight for me. Just stand for what's right. That's all I ever needed from you. Thomas." I held the paper for a long time. The words blurred and reformed through the tears I didn't realize were falling. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a reminder that he had seen everything, even what I couldn't. The second envelope was thinner. Inside was an older copy of the will, the one we had signed together years ago, before Lydia took over. My name was there, written clearly beside his. The same signature, the same date. The real one. He had kept it hidden, not for secrecy, but for safekeeping, for this moment. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope. Then I sat in the study for a while, the light shifting slowly across the floor. It was strange how the room no longer felt haunted. It felt full again, like he was still here somehow, not in the air, but in the proof of his trust, Later that afternoon, I called Edward and asked him to come by. When he arrived, I handed him the envelope. "It's not for another case," I said. "It's just for the record. I want it archived, so history doesn't get erased." He nodded quietly, understanding. "You're not looking for victory anymore," he said. I smiled faintly. "No, I just want the truth to stay where it belongs." Edward took the letter, holding it with both hands. "I'll make sure of it." When he left, I stayed by the window, watching the light fade into soft orange. I reached for the pocket watch on the table. The hands were still frozen at 11:11, and I realized I didn't need to wind it anymore. It had done its part. It had carried time long enough for me to find my way back. I placed it gently beside Thomas's letter and whispered, "You were right. Decency does survive ambition." The evening air drifted in through the open window, warm and calm. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in the ruins of something. I was standing where I belonged. I didn't win against anyone. I just returned to the place that was always mine. The first spring after everything ended came slowly, like the world was relearning how to breathe. The days grew longer, the air softer, and the river by the house glittered again under the morning light. It had been months since the board closed its investigation. Lydia had quietly resigned, and the Carter Legacy Trust had been placed under an interim committee. The news stories had faded, replaced by newer scandals, newer names. But for me, life had returned to something simpler: silence, coffee, sunlight. That morning, I drove out to the Riverside Conservatory just outside Charleston. Thomas and I had helped plant the first magnolia trees there years ago, long before the foundation had money, long before there were photographers and speeches. Back then, it was just an empty patch of soil and a hope that something good could grow from it. When I arrived, the air smelled of fresh grass and spring rain. The path to the garden was lined with small white signs bearing the names of donors and volunteers. My name was on one of them, half faded now. I ran my fingers over it gently, then followed the path toward the magnolia grove. The trees were in full bloom. The petals were wide and white, catching the light in a way that made them look almost translucent. The last time I'd stood there, the flowers had been small, still fighting the cold. Now they were everywhere. Thick branches, full blossoms, bees moving lazily between them. I stood quietly among them for a while, just listening to the hum of the garden, the sound of life doing what it always does, moving forward without permission, without noise. A young voice broke the stillness behind me. "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Carter?" I turned. A girl stood near the bench, maybe 17 or 18, holding a notebook against her chest. She had dark curls pulled into a loose bun and eyes that carried a kind of honest brightness I hadn't seen in a long time. "Yes," I said softly. "I am." She smiled shyly. "I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to say thank you. I got the Carter Heritage Scholarship this year. It means I can start college in the fall." I blinked, surprised. "You're part of the program?" She nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They told us the scholarship was started by you and your husband, for students who wanted to do community work. I'm going to study environmental science." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just looked at her, young, hopeful, standing in the same garden Thomas and I had once stood in, talking about what might grow here someday. I smiled. "I'm glad," I said quietly. "Thomas would be too." The girl hesitated, then asked, "Were you the one who started all this?" I shook my head. "No, not just me. It belongs to everyone who was never seen, never heard, the ones we tried to make room for." She smiled again, a little tearful, and reached out to shake my hand. Her grip was warm, steady. "Thank you," she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently. "Keep doing what you love," I said. "That's how this place keeps growing." She nodded, then walked down the path toward the greenhouse, her notebook pressed to her chest. I watched her go, her figure framed by sunlight and magnolia petals drifting in the breeze. When she disappeared around the corner, I turned back toward the grove. Near the entrance stood a bronze plaque, one Thomas had designed himself. It was weathered now, the edges green with age, but the engraving was still clear. For those who plant for a future they may never see. I ran my fingers across the words, tracing each letter slowly. That sentence had been his dream. His way of saying that goodness didn't need applause to last. It only needed to be planted. The wind picked up slightly, and a few petals fell around me, soft against my coat. I looked up through the branches. The sunlight filtered through the white flowers, scattering into tiny reflections across the ground. It was strange how peaceful everything felt. No anger, no bitterness, not even sadness. Just quiet understanding. Everything that had been broken was still here, only rearranged, like the garden itself, stronger for what it had weathered. I sat on the bench for a while, watching the river through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children laughing, the sound of a school group visiting the garden. It made me smile. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like someone looking back. I felt like someone standing in the middle of something still alive. Before leaving, I reached into my coat pocket and took out the silver watch. The hand still pointed to 11:11, frozen forever. I placed it on the bench for a moment, the sunlight glinting off its surface. Thomas used to say that time isn't about minutes or hours. It's about what we leave behind in between them. I finally understood what he meant. I picked up the watch, held it close, and whispered, "You were right. Justice blooms like this. Quietly, but it stays." As I walked back down the path, the magnolia petals brushed against my sleeve. The air was bright, full of light, full of everything that had once seemed lost. Justice doesn't shout. It grows, steady, patient, and enduring. The evening light spilled softly across the porch, turning the river gold. The air was warm, touched with the faint scent of magnolia drifting from the trees by the fence. I sat in my usual chair, the same one Thomas used to fix every spring, a blanket over my knees and a cup of tea in my hand. The sun was setting low behind the bridge, its reflection stretching across the water like a slow, steady breath. I hadn't realized how long I'd been sitting there until the sky began to turn from orange to soft blue. On the table beside me lay the silver pocket watch. For months it had been silent, frozen at 11:11, the moment Thomas left, the moment everything seemed to stop. But now, the hands were moving again. The ticking was gentle even, like a small heartbeat. I didn't remember winding it that morning. Maybe I had, without thinking. Or maybe some things just start again on their own, when the time is right. I sipped my tea and watched the light flicker on the water. For a long time, I'd been afraid of silence. It had felt like a punishment, the sound of things ending. But now it felt different. It felt earned. I thought about everything that had happened. The will, the lies, the courtroom papers, the faces that turned away and then turned back when truth forced them to. None of it had been dramatic in the end. Justice hadn't come with noise or applause. It had come like the tide, slow and certain, washing away what didn't belong. I reached for the watch again, feeling its weight in my palm. The steady rhythm of its ticking blended with the wind outside, a sound so small it could have been missed. But I heard it. I always would. And then I spoke. Not to anyone in particular, maybe just to the air, maybe to him. "I'm not the line they crossed out anymore," I said quietly. "I'm the one who wrote it back. Not with signatures, not with lawyers or papers, but with being here, still standing, still real." The words didn't feel like defiance. They felt like peace. I leaned back, watching the first star appear above the river. Somewhere in the garden, a wind chime moved gently, its sound soft and uncertain, like laughter half remembered. The world wasn't perfect. Lydia still existed out there, living her version of the story. The papers would sit in archives, the board would move on, and the world would forget the details. But the truth, the real truth, had been placed where it belonged. Safe, honest, permanent. That was enough. The light faded slowly, turning the porch into a soft glow. I felt the warmth of the teacup in my hand, the cool air against my face, the quiet rhythm of time returning to itself. The watch ticked on beside me, not as a reminder of what was lost, but of what survived. As the camera of memory pulled away, the porch, the water, the setting sun, I could almost hear Thomas's voice again, gentle as always. "Kindness outlasts everything, Helen, even the noise." The wind stirred through the magnolia trees, scattering a few petals across the porch floor. One landed near the watch, pale and perfect. I smiled, because this was what victory looked like. Not loud, not grand, but steady. I whispered one last time, the words barely above a breath. "Not every victory needs to be loud. Some are just about being seen." The screen faded to gold, the ticking blended with the wind, and a single magnolia petal drifted across the frame, bright, quiet, and free.